goodness, sheesh, Akpik, thank you so much. And thanks to the panelists who have already gone before. I know this seems like a little hodgepodge of topics, but they really are all connected. Anyway, my name is Djuk Suk. My English name is Debra. My mom was born and raised in Mountain Village, Alaska, up on Yukon River, and her mom and my great grandmother and father were both born and raised and lived in Wrangell, which is right across the channel from where I currently reside, which is in what's known as Petersburg, or Sitkakwan, as we Tlinkits used to call this area, and are now reclaiming that name, which is really fun. I've lived here for about 2 years and we're having fun reclaiming it, from letting the Norwegians know that there are really Tlinkits that live here in Petersburg. So it's great. I am the Senior Policy Specialist for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And as Akpik said, I've worked as a practicing lawyer for 31 years and a tribal court judge for about 15 years, and have worked primarily, not exclusively, but primarily for Northwest and/or Alaskan tribes, including my own tribe, Tlingit and Haida. And in that work, I was asked to talk about the Indian Child Welfare Act, which I've worked with both in tribal courts, in policy settings with state and tribal policymakers, as well as in the state courts. This is a federal law that passed in 1978, and it was in direct response to the overwhelming evidence. And of course, our federal government doesn't move very quickly. So it was years and years and years in the making of getting this bill passed, this new law passed in 1978. And it was due in part because there was overwhelming evidence of Indian children across the country continually and systematically being stolen and removed from their homes and then adopted out. And so there was, and the problem had gotten to be so big that it really, the movement and families and policymakers really forced the government to do something about it. And while this law, and I'm not going to go into exactly what the law does, except that it mandates what the state court can and cannot do and what it must do in contacting the tribes when an Indian child has been removed, or is the possibility of that child being removed from their family. An Indian child is defined, and it also makes possible, or makes mandated, that the tribe that child is a citizen of or is eligible for enrollment in is a party to the child welfare case happening in state court. So that's huge, because it puts the children's tribe in a position to have a say-so and participate in any state court proceedings. So that's about as technical as I'm going to get on the actual law and what it does. While this law was really important, and it has been in place for a really long time, since 1978, it has not stopped the disproportionate rate of Indian children who continue to be lost in the child welfare system. And I'm just going to speak about Alaska a little bit. The population-wise, Alaska Native children make up the vast majority by per capita of children in the state child welfare system. One solution to turn around these statistics so that children are not, our Native children are not caught up into the state system, and I'll tell you some of the reasons why we want that to not be happening, is we need to look at getting more equal access and equal resources and services into the tribal courts that are complementary, or at least on par with the state courts. The Indian Child Welfare Act really doesn't have a chance of working. and achieving what it had set out to do until our courts, our tribal courts, actually are on equal footing with the state courts. And I say that because one of the things that is able to happen at the within ICWA is that tribes can come into state courts and ask for the child welfare case to be transferred over to the tribal courts. But in order for that to happen, our tribal courts have to have the resources and services available for the families and for the children. And that's not happening. Once a state court case is transferred over to the tribal courts, any services that have been going into that family, to the parents, to the children, for counseling, for treatment, for education, for supervised visitation, for making sure that there's family contact and support, especially for the children, they just stop. The services don't transfer from the state, even though, and I just want to emphasize this, and I've noticed that OCPIC has been putting in good poignant quotes from our speakers, even though our tribal children, our Native children, are both citizens of their tribe and citizens of the state. And again, I just want to emphasize this: when a child welfare case transfers from the state to the tribal court, and there's good reasons to do that, because I think there's, and I'll go into that in a minute, that child and that family don't cease to be citizens of the state, but the services provided and available from the state do cease. And the problem with that is the federal government sends money to the states, not just Alaska, but all of the states, money to support families in crisis and children in particular in crisis. So when the case then gets transferred to tribal court, that obligation from the state doesn't cease. So that's one thing that I really want to emphasize. And so one of the things that we are really looking at emphasizing and trying to build up some momentum on this is for the federal government to hold the states accountable for the monies that the states do receive, and that those should pass on and follow the families into tribal court. In this way, our tribal courts have a little better chance of actually building some of the infrastructure that it needs, that they need to be able to provide the services that families need. I just want to let folks know too, I'm not a PowerPoint person. I really appreciate the previous speakers who had PowerPoints. I'm envious of that, and I've never quite mastered that. So you only get to listen to me, and I don't have any great pictures for it. So, but I'm enjoying all the pictures that you all have on your profile page, profile pictures. Okay. I and many others have argued that the tribal court, or as I refer to them as tribal justice systems, when they have enough resources to provide significant services to the Native families who are coming into the system because they are experiencing trauma, violence, and or substance abuse issues. Unfortunately, few of the tribal courts in our state here have those services, have those resources, and are unable to provide that. And so that's what we're working for. And why is this important? I think because what's happening is we're seeing too many of our Native children going into the state child welfare system because the investigation and removal process is wrought with biases, assumptions, presumptions that, and stereotypical prejudices that really increase the number of children that come into, of our children that go into the system, and then they stay there longer. And I won't go, this isn't a tirade about how difficult or terrible the state system is. And I'm also not saying that everything's going to be perfect in the tribal courts, but they certainly are going to be a little bit better for a number of reasons. The cultural appropriate services are going to be able to be offered in tribal court. There's also going to be much faster and more frequent hearings or opportunities for parents who are having difficulties for one reason or another, whether it's they don't have the parenting skills, or they have substance abuse issues, or they have violence issues that are plaguing their family. The best way to turn that around, any social worker, and I'm not a social worker, but any social worker or social services person will tell you that the best way to help change behavior is to have frequent interactions and interventions with those folks in crisis. And so in a tribal court setting that has much lower caseloads and are going to be able to have hearings more often, as well as the social service providers that are available in the tribe. So I want to talk a little bit about children, and I was asked, as was all the previous speakers, to talk about the connection between MMIW, domestic violence, and Indian children in the child welfare system. And I'm not going to repeat. I think Kristen and Josie did a great job of just touching on that and talking about it. And I also just want to add, Ine, I really appreciate that you said you were nervous. I always get nervous, even after 30 years of speaking publicly. I still get nervous sometimes. So I appreciate that you were that you put that out there and let us all know, because I'm a little nervous as well, even though this is a topic that I am really familiar with, and I could probably, rather than just talk for 10 or 15 minutes, could talk for a couple of hours on this, because I really firmly believe that if our tribal justice systems had all the resources that they need and were available to help our families that are in crisis, not just the parents would benefit, but most particular, the children would benefit. And what's happening with our children, both in the state system and in a inadequately resourced tribal justice system, is that our children are being thrown into child welfare systems at high proportionate rates through no fault of their own. And unfortunately, sometimes through no fault of one or both of their parents. Because we live in a society that holds Native people and people of color to a higher standard. Poverty, alcohol and drug abuse or substance abuse situations, or even violence in your home is being held against parents, and then the children get thrown into the system due to that behavior, as well as children being put in a position where they are witnessing this in their home. They're being harmed by domestic violence, and the response from the state is to remove them from the only home that they have experienced, albeit it may be very unsafe, but not putting them necessarily with relatives or trusting adults who are known to them, but throwing them into homes of strangers known as the foster care system, and with little or no contact with their parents and or their siblings, whether the siblings are older or younger, all increasing the trauma that's experienced by the children. And these are children, as you know, these are children that are just starting to walk to teenagers, and the same trauma and same lack of security and blaming themselves is what happened, is what manifests. The child welfare system as it's operated now is just helps to exaggerate or helps to increase the instability and trustingness of the children. So there's several practices that are entrenched, that have just become, and I use the word entrenched, and I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it has become so integrated into the system that and I'm going to just put it out there. It has become so integrated into the social services system that you social workers that are who are participating here are going to take a step back a little bit, but I'm going to explain why I'm saying this. There are some concepts and practices in the child welfare system that are so ingrained, but they also perpetuate some of the prejudices, biases, and unequal practices that so significantly affect our Native children. And those are mandatory reporting and how it is being applied, and how it's being applied specifically to neglect and the concept of failure to protect. And so what's happening is that those definitions of the word neglect, or the image of neglect of a child by a parent or a guardian, and the failure to protect is being used in ways for Native children that we don't see being used necessarily for other parents who are not Native. And now I say that there's some systematic practices that are entrenched. Those are just the ones that I think rise to the top as I was preparing for today. And I don't want to go through all of them because this is not a thesis on or a rant against the child welfare system. Really, I was asked to talk about the connection. But I think if we can rethink something as simple as the definitions of neglect and failure to protect, and then add to that discussion how to define it so that, and how to respond to when we see neglect, or when the system sees neglect and failure to protect, what can be put into that home to increase the safety, security, and nurturing of the children by the parents. And if it's not the parents, because for whatever deficiencies or problems that they may be having individually, then is there other relatives, whether it's an older sibling, an aunt, uncle, or grandparent, then let's look for different ways that we can do that. And we can be really creative. And that, again, is why I always have advocated for increase in our services to tribal courts, so that we can bring our children home and help to build that nurturing and safety in the homes as we can. The other thing I want to talk about a little bit is domestic violence in the home. And this, I think it was all of our previous speakers said we're sort of talking about the really bad things that happen. I think bad things that happen here, and so I'm not going to be any different than my co-panelists here. When domestic violence happens in the home, children are affected. Whether they're in the room or not, children are affected. They hear what's happening. They hear the arguments. They hear the hits. They walk out of hiding after a violent occurrence, and they see the blood, or they see the bruises, or they see the crying. Or if there's law enforcement that is responding, they see the officers appear. So they're witnesses. Children are witnesses to the violence that are happening in our homes. Or they are actual victims and harmed themselves because they try to intervene. And they are our first responders. They are the ones who go to the person who has been harmed and try to help, or to intervene, or to stop the violence. And way too often are the ones who are then having to call 911. And of course, the connection here to child welfare is often when the situation requires either social services or law enforcement to be called and children are present, then they enter the child welfare system. So imagine, and this is just one of the examples that I'm going to talk about, just imagine a young child who has witnessed or heard an altercation, a violent altercation, and then calls 911 because that's what children are taught to do when they need help. And law enforcement comes and they are taken away and their parents are taken away and no help comes into that family. And even worse, that child is removed from the only home that he or she knows. And then the blame that comes along with that. Okay, so that's just one example of some of the things that can happen. All right. Things that we can do as change makers, and I really love that term, change makers. I always thought politicians were supposed to be the change makers, but that's become, I quickly learned to not, sometimes not think that politicians are all about making things better, but really making things better for themselves. Anyway, that's a small editorial comment, and I'll go on. Change makers. How can we protect our children from entering the state's foster system, which is, and I've just laid out a few of the reasons, and I'm sure all of you or many of you can tell stories and ways that the state foster care system is just not a healthy place for children to be raised in. So some of the things that we can do, we can strengthen the tribal courts so that children have an increased chance of being placed with relatives. They have an increased chance of returning home because when they have returned home, they have an increased chance of their parents or parent being more healthy and able to parent in a safe, secure, and appropriate way. They also have a better chance, the children and the parents have a better chance of receiving appropriate and culturally significant services that don't isolate them from their community, but actually integrate them into the community where the support can be found. Stronger tribal courts also will shorten the time between hearings, helping to set up an accountability for those who are needing services and or treatment. And the continued accountability also helps, and more frequent visitation with the children, between the children and the parents and other relatives also helps keep parents motivated as to the benefits for them getting well and taking care of the situation that caused entry into the welfare system to begin with. And I just want to add, and I think Kristen and or Josie mentioned this, so I'm just going to end with our children way too often who have gone through are in the child welfare system right now. And this was a universal statement for most, not just Alaska child welfare system, but most of the state systems throughout the country. They often get put into, and sometimes lost, way too often lost, into the foster care system and grow up there through no fault of their own, through the behavior of somebody else, through their parents who they love and is the only parent that they know. That process, that isolation from family, that being raised in a institutional or in a system that doesn't have the things that a family or relatives can, or a native community can provide. increases the risk of substance abuse, suicide, and increases their general vulnerability, and which targets them for predators, increases their chances of being trafficked or entering into violent relationships or situations themselves. The fix is to fixing the child welfare system will certainly help decrease that. But I believe that the fix really is to be able to strengthen our tribal justice systems so that children can come home to the tribes and to the tribal community. That will take resources and more services to do that in collaboration with the state, and also forcing the state to take seriously the fact that while our children are citizens of our nations, they're also citizens of the state, and the state has a responsibility to do right by them. And that's all I have. I want to thank thank the work group that I have the pleasure of working with every week, to echo what OCPIC said, and we get a lot done together. So it's just, I'll just end with, we get so much more done. We don't always agree on everything, but that's okay, because we have a ready think tank to float ideas around and to learn from each other and to work together. And we are much mightier in our numbers than we would be individually. Thanks, everybody.